Πω εδώ ότι το δεύτερο μέρος της ημερίδας θα επικεντρωθεί στις εργασιακές και τις εισοδηματικές ανισότητες, στις κοινωνικές επιπτώσεις, καθώς και στις πολιτικές για την αντιμετώπιση τους. Ομιλητές είναι ο καθηγητής του Πανεπιστημίου του Warwick και συντονιστής του Ευρωπαϊκού Έργου Gusto, κύριος Colin Crouch, και η κυρία Βιρτζίνια Μαέστρη από τη Γενική Διεύθυνση Απασχόλησης, Κοινωνικών Υποθέσεων και Κοινωνικής Ένταξης της Ευρωπαϊκής Επιτροπής, η οποία ως τέος ερευνήτρια του Πανεπιστημίου του Άμστερνταμ υπήρξε και συντονίστρια του Ευρωπαϊκού Έργου Gini. Συντονίζει ο ομότιμος καθηγητής Οικονομικών Κοινωνικής Πολιτικής του Παντίου Πανεπιστημίου, κύριος Σάββας Ρομπόλης. Παρακαλώ, κύριε καθηγητά, έχετε το λόγο. Γιατί δεν ακούνε? Όχι. Πριν σας δώσω το λόγο, να ξαναπώ σε όλους όσους δεν μας ακούγανε και τώρα μας ακούνε ίσως, ότι ξεκινάει το δεύτερο μέρος, για να μην έχουμε καθυστέρηση, ευθύς αμέσως. Κύριε Ρομπόλη.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Το δεύτερο μέρος είναι εργασιακές και εισοδηματικές ανισότητες. Δίνω το λόγο στον συνάδελφο Colin Crouch και το θέμα της εισήγησής του είναι εργασία, ανισότητες και κοινωνική πολιτική.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. And for my first visit in my life to Athens, which since I'm very old is very shameful on my part, but I've now managed to remedy this. Now my project in the Framework 7 program, one called Gusto, or Gusto if you speak English, was concerned with insecurity and uncertainty, especially on labour markets, and whether social policies at the European level and at national levels were helping people with their problems of insecurity or making them worse. And there is, I've summarized in the paper, which I think you can access on the website, summarized the main lines of what emerged from our work. But I think if we talk about this issue at the present moment, there is, as they say in the English language, an elephant in the room. An elephant in the room is some enormous thing that's there and you pretend it isn't there. And our elephant actually has a very good Greek name, which is xenophobia. Recently we've seen in the European elections an enormous rise of various kinds of xenophobic feelings, anti-immigrant feelings, anti-Europe feelings. And these are clearly related to issues of insecurity, but in complex ways. There is a tendency to explain the rise in right-wing populism in terms of problems of the European project itself. But I do not believe that can be sustained, because similar movements, for example, are found in Norway and Switzerland, which are not fully part of the European project. Similar xenophobic, nationalistic elements are found in the Tea Party movement in the United States. The Japanese government has recently begun to emphasize nationalistic aspects of Japan's past that it was widely believed had gone forever from Japan. The recent Indian elections were won by a Hindu anti-Islamic nationalist party. This is not an EU problem, and it's false for people like the British government to pretend it's all about too much European integration. And that the standing behind the xenophobic elephant is the wider process of globalization. It is globalization that brings us together across the world in ways that make many people feel insecure, partly through the economic turbulence that globalization brings, partly through the immigration that necessarily accompanies a globalization of an economy. And it would not be right to respond to these problems by trying to reverse the process of globalization, because that means to go back to hiding behind national economies that restrict trade with each other. And that is in none of our interests. Globalization gradually serves all of our interests. This might seem a long-term thing. At the moment, people in the advanced world believe that they are suffering from globalization. It's taking jobs away to the Far East. It's bringing immigrants in from poorer countries. But already, actually, our economies are seeing the benefit in increased sales to enormous new markets in the Far East. And there are other ways in which globalization benefits us. And this week, I've been in 2 countries. I've been in my own country in Britain, and I've been here in Greece. On both occasions, at the same time I have been in the country, there has been a visit from the Chinese government. These are coincidences. But in both cases, both Britain and Greece have been engaged in enormous bargains over Chinese financing of vital infrastructure projects. That would not have happened without globalization. If China was still a poverty-stricken country isolated behind its bamboo curtain, we would not be having these discussions with China today. So we cannot deal with the problems of insecurity and xenophobia that are produced by globalization by saying, let us stop globalization. We have to find ways of coming through this. And now, obviously, someone like myself who studies social policy, we want to argue that provided we can do enough through social policy to reassure people about uncertainty, then we can reduce all these problems. It is partly true, but it's only partly true. Because if people who felt secure and very comfortable in their lives did not experience problems of xenophobia, then why would we have right-wing populist movements in Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Switzerland, some of the most secure countries in the world? There are other, because the way in which globalization works is far more complex than just social policy. And since I'm going to spend most of my time arguing about where social policy is relevant, I think it's important that people like myself do recognize the greater depth and enormous complexity of the issues, and that we do not appear simple-minded and naive. One aspect of globalization is a kind of imposition of Western institutions and values and practices on other parts of the world. We do not notice this because we are part of that process. But people in other parts of the world can feel threatened by that and hostile to it. And the people who have found the most ready means of combating it are certain kinds of extreme Islamists. And Islamic terrorism has to be seen as one of the responses to globalization from the people on whom globalization is being imposed. Their behavior then creates xenophobic, Islamophobic reactions in the West and in India. So you can understand some of the way in which Indian and Danish people are behaving at the present time as a response to Islamic terror, which in itself is a kind of response to globalization. So globalization is dangerous. We have to go down its path, but there are dangers. And in addition to the social policy issues I want to talk about, another issue that has to be dealt with is somehow trying to transcend, get beyond the strong sense of nation that so many of us have. If you look at the present time of what's going on in Ukraine, Ukrainians and Russians have a very large part of their culture in common. Their religions are almost the same. Their languages are very similar. This is not a great clash of culture. It's a clash of national identity. But people of two nations whose governments and states really do very, very little for them, actually. And yet the fierceness of attachment to these actually rather similar state structures is leading them to kill each other. Probably this morning more have been killed. And this is the problem of the strength of national identities, even when it doesn't involve big cultural differences, that I think are probably incompatible with a more globalized world. And yet one of the ways in which governments can try to negotiate the problems of insecurity and uncertainty that come with globalization is to compensate people with a very strong sense of national identity. You see this in my country now. You see it in Japan. You see it in India. Yes, you are going to face a lot of insecurity through economic change, and you've got to accept that, but you can be proud of being a member of this nation. That's the formula that's used. It's very, very successful, and of course, in the long run, it is totally disastrous, because eventually globalization clashes with that strong sense of nationhood. It's interesting that the country in Europe where so far xenophobic movements have been smallest, though they do exist, is Germany. Germany is the only country, certainly in Europe, which really has taught itself for some generations now, since 1945, that a very strong sense of national superiority and confidence can be deeply evil. No one has ever told British people that, or Greek people, or French people, or Danish people. We see nothing wrong with being extremely proud, even feeling superior about our national values, our national institutions. But as we increasingly enter a globalizing world, those strong senses of nation can be involved in generating hatreds of strangers with disastrous consequences. As I said, social policy cannot deal with all of this by any means. But social policy is relevant in a number of respects. First of all, it's relevant in that by reducing the level of insecurity people feel and the level of uncertainty, by increasing their trust in institutions, they are less likely to feel fearful. And it is people who feel fear who become the most dangerous in these very explosive situations. And this is where we need to see the anxieties and insecurities and disturbances to people's lives as among the negative externalities of marketization. I hope that is translating into Greek. Not many people can understand that in English, even if they are born English speakers. But we know that whenever we intensify markets, we produce some damage that the market itself can't clean up. And the biggest and most important example is pollution and environmental damage. But that's, and everyone can understand that, right? That the market, the participants in a market process do not have to pay for the pollution they create, unless, of course, there's government intervention to force them to pay. But the market itself doesn't produce that. But there can be other externalities, negative externalities of the market. And insecurity to people's lives coming from rapid economic change is another one of these. And this means that when we make more markets and intensify markets, as we need to do and want to do in Europe and elsewhere, we also create more of these negative consequences that have to be dealt with other means. And this is unfortunate because the whole logic of political debate, the whole confrontation in the politics of our countries is usually more market versus less market, or More market against stopping the market. That's how our politics is organized, as though there's a kind of zero-sum game. The more market you have, then the less social policy you have. The more social policy you have, the less market you have. But actually, the exact opposite is the case. The more we have market, the more we need social policy, not to stop the market, but partly to compensate its victims, partly to protect people whose security is damaged by intensification of labour market processes, and partly actually to provide the infrastructure that markets need that they can't generate for themselves. And if the market could generate all the infrastructure that it needed, it wouldn't be necessary for the Chinese government to subsidise the port of Piraeus or a high-speed railway line across England. And so we need to get an approach to politics that sees these processes as complementary and not as rivals. And this is what is so difficult. Now, the European project itself, European integration, has always been mainly a marketization project. That's how it started off, as a common market. But there has always been, alongside it, a social dimension that has come out in various different ways. And the original common agricultural policy was a way of protecting farmers who were likely to be threatened by modernization. It starts off being a policy for helping French and Italian peasants. It eventually became a project for helping large agribusiness corporations in Northern Europe, but that's another part of the European story. But it started off as a social policy. The structural funds, which have done so much to help infrastructure, not only here in Greece and in Central Europe, but also in parts of Britain and other Northern European countries, were a part of social policy or infrastructure policy going alongside the market-making process. When the presidency of Jacques Delors introduced the single market process, which was a serious market-making process, alongside that came the new social dimension that was meant to lead to negotiations among employers and unions that would eventually lead to a series of directives in social policy areas. It had a few early successes, but it has been almost dead for some time now. For some time, all the debate about labour markets in Europe was about the need for more flexibility, which means more insecurity for workers. At a certain moment, the beginning of this century, it was realised that if you're going to do this to people, if you're going to make labour markets more and more flexible, they need new kinds of security to help them through that process, using mainly policy examples from Denmark and the Netherlands. And the Commission and the Union took up these themes. Very quickly, however, it disappeared. It was a perfect example of market protection going alongside market making. But it very soon disappeared because through the open method of coordination, almost anything could be defined as flexicurity was the concept used for it. Everything, and it lost meaning. And then in more recent years, the role of European integration as a market-making process only has intensified. The extension of the competition policy to include what used to be called public services, but are now called services of general interest, is an example of that, because this suggests that all services, including education, health, training, are simply other goods traded in the market and for individual consumers to acquire, rather than being seen as a special category of things that are important to being outside the process of the market, supporting the market, compensating against the market. It's true, it's possible, in recognition of that, it is possible for governments to reserve areas that they don't expose to the Competition Directorate, but that's getting more and more difficult because there's increasing challenges in the European Court from corporations. And if we ever get the big transatlantic treaty with the EU, one of the main American demands will really be the complete opening of public services in Europe to competition from corporations. Also, the European Court in recent years has increasingly started to decide that various aspects of the industrial relations systems of the Nordic countries are incompatible with competition law. Even though these institutions have been responsible for assisting those countries to their extraordinary strong social and economic performances, they're increasingly having trouble, which is in turn, of course, producing hostility to the European Union in those countries. And then finally, the sort of so far, the extreme point of this Europe as market making only comes in the Greek memorandum from the Troika, and less explicitly, but also clearly in the messages given to Spain, Portugal, Italy, and to some extent Ireland. There's nothing there to suggest a move away from existing welfare states in the southern European countries towards social policies that help flexicurity, policies that link strengthening infrastructure, improving training, improving labour skills. Because of the crisis of public spending and because of the role of German, Dutch, French and other banks in steering the whole process, the emphasis is just on reducing all impediments to the market, which the only logic is to say that Greek and Italian and Spanish, Portuguese workers must eventually compete at the lowest level of markets and to find themselves competing with Bulgaria and Romania and beyond. The idea that you acquire competitiveness by upgrading the quality of what you do and that you use public policy to help that is just not found in this latest stage of European policy. The struggle again was between defending an existing set of welfare institutions which in southern Europe do not function well. They do not redistribute much from rich to poor. They do very little to assist the reconstruction of new labour markets and new strong economic institutions. They're poorly functioning. But the conflict has become defending those poor institutions against abolishing them and not replacing them with much else. And we really have to get out of that. One of the speakers this afternoon is Frank van der Broeke, who is one of the leading exponents of the ideas of the social investment welfare state, which he and a number of colleagues in Belgium, the Netherlands, France, the Scandinavian countries have been working on for some years, as to how the welfare state is not just there to compensate victims, it's not just there to give handouts to people, it can be used to strengthen the labour force in its qualities and its skills and its ability to manage the work-life balance of families, things that will strengthen an economy. And those concepts of the social investment welfare state need to be brought into the forefront of European policy making if it is going to be able to do the job of helping people deal with the market as well as exposing them to more and more market. One model, favoured I think increasingly actually in the Nordic countries, is to say, well, yeah, okay, Europe does the market making, but leave our national social institutions alone, please. And we'll handle that. So market making will be European and perhaps national. Social policy and market protection, dealing with negative externalities, that's going to be just national. That's dangerous, because increasingly that means European policy will develop, as it has been for the last 3 or 4 years, without any understanding of the needs of social policy. So if at the European level of the Parliament and the Commission, we lose expertise and understanding of social policy. That just means the market-making project will go on like the European Court is doing at the present time. And secondly, it reinforces those senses of national identity and national pride that actually need to be weakened if we are to cope with globalization without xenophobia. So we need European social policy more than we have before, not less, in the face of the current crises facing us. Thank you very much.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ τον κύριο Κράουτς και χωρίς κανένα σχόλιο να συνεχίσουμε στην επόμενη ομιλήτρια, τη Βιρτζίνια Μαέστρη, με θέμα «Πέρα από τα όρια της αγοράς. Μια ιστορία ανατροπής των οικονομικών ανισοτήτων σε εύπορες χώρες».
So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting a young member of the Gini project. As it was said before, I was working for the Gini project until last year, and now I'm working for the European Commission at DG Employment. So before starting the presentation, I have to make just a little disclaimer that what I'm presenting here does not necessarily reflect the European Commission views. I will present here some selected results of the Gini project and some updates with the most recent trends of income and wealth inequality. This was not the main part of the Gini project because, of course, we were still at the beginning of the crisis, so it was not the focus of the project, but I'm trying to present some new results. So the core of the presentation is basically on the trends and drivers of income and wealth inequality. And I will explain why this presentation has a title, Beyond Market Forces, and why inequalities are changing. So just to give a context to this presentation, it was already mentioned this morning, the shift in the debate on inequalities. I just would like to stress the shift in the attention from the beginning of the crisis until now. We start in 2008 with the publication of the famous book of Wilkinson and Pickett, The Spirit Level, which stress the social impacts of inequality. After that, there were several works, especially by the OECD, on documenting the general increase in inequality in the last decades. However, more recently, there was the attention shift to the economic effects of inequality. So inequality is not bad just because of the social effects, but because it can create, it can have bad effects on macroeconomic performance of countries. And the last, shift in the policy debate was the shift to wealth inequality. And this, of course, I refer to the famous book of Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century. This is also to stress that until now, we are in the policy debate, we are not discussing about inequality because of social justice issues, but just because of the effects that it can have. So, what changed in the last years? If we observe the trends in income inequality in the last decades, we see that inequality was generally increasing in many countries, but not all the countries. And the notable exception to this general increasing trends were Greece, Spain, and Ireland, where inequality was decreasing. If we look at the map now, inequality is still increasing, in less countries than before, which is puzzling because we are in a recession and we would expect a stronger increase in inequality now than before. So what happened is that in the past decades, actually, the largest increase in inequality were experienced by, first of all, the transition countries with the Eastern European countries, of course, because they passed from communist to capitalism, so that was one reason. The second example is the UK, which experienced a large increase of inequality. But, I mean, what is most interesting is that the largest increase in inequality beyond these countries in Europe was experienced by the famous Nordic countries, in particular Sweden and Finland. What we see now is that inequality is decreasing in countries where it was previously increasing, for example, UK and Finland, and is increasing where it was previously decreasing. And this is the case of Greece and Spain in particular. Does this situation, the situation of the current situation of inequality looks better? I would say no, because of course, I mean, poverty and social exclusion is increasing. So it's not only inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient, it actually is very sensitive to the middle of the income distribution. In some countries, such as Greece, median income fell, so this results in a deterioration of living condition. And the last warning is that these estimates, recent estimates of income inequality, they are probably optimistic estimates because standard measures of inequality, of income inequality, do not include consumption taxes, which increased in the last years, and do not include in-kind benefits. And again, we have seen a cut in in-kind benefits such as healthcare and education. So this is one of the main results of the Gini project. I think the strength of the Gini project was the attention to the trends in inequality in the last decades before the crisis that may be more interesting than the current trends which hide more complicated issues. And the second advantage was that we look not only at European countries, but mostly at OECD countries. So what I want to show here is that inequality increased, but this increase was not blind. So the patterns of income inequality were very, very different across countries, and those across similar countries. So here I report just a few examples. For instance, among transition countries, there was, of course, an increase in inequality after the transition, but this increase was very different. For example, in Estonia, we had a sharp increase at the very beginning, and then inequality actually leveled off and actually decreased in the latest years, while in Latvia, this increase was continuous. Then we had the UK and the US, which experienced a continuous increase in income inequality starting in the 80s. In the UK, it was particularly concentrated in the 80s during the Thatcher years. In another group of countries, the increase in inequality happened much later, so it started in the 90s, and it followed the economic crisis of the beginning of the 90s. Also here we can notice large differences. So for example, in Italy, the increase was completely episodic. It only happened after the 92 recession. So there was a sharp increase in inequality, and after this increase, inequality was kind of stable. In Korea, it happened the same. So after the crisis of 97, there was an increase in inequality, but this increase was persistent. And the same we notice in Sweden and Finland, which experienced an increase in inequality starting from the recession of the early 90s. So why I show this? Why the trends and patterns of inequality, of income inequality, are important? They are important because they show that standard theories of inequality, such as skill bias, technological change, are not enough to explain the increase in income inequality. This is because, I mean, the spread of technology is not episodic. It was, I mean, is it strange that it increased in different ways and in different years, I mean, with a difference of decades in different countries. On top of this, standard theories of inequality are not able to explain why the increase of inequality follow recession, and these increases are persistent, so they are not cyclical. It's not only an effect of the recession, we should be temporary. The last point is that wage inequality increased also in countries where the returns to education were not increasing. This is just an overview of the Gini country reports, in particular on the labor market stylized facts. Here we analyze various factors like female participation, flexibilization of the labor market, and returns to education. Red actually means factors that are pro-inequality, and green factors that are reducing inequality. What this table shows is that there were contrasting forces in the labor markets, which had an impact on wage inequality. However, we see that in a few countries, such as Italy, Canada, or Austria, we see an increase in wage inequality, but at the same time, a decrease in the returns to education. And this is explained by the increasing flexibilization of the labor market, so a policy explanation more than an economic one. So another important driver of the increase in income inequality in the last decades is redistribution. We have seen in the last decades an enormous decrease in the number of tax brackets for personal income taxation and a drastic reduction in top marginal income tax rate. Here I would just like to make a few examples. And again, I take Sweden and Finland because these are two very crucial countries for the increase in inequality in the last decades, to show also the importance of discretionary policy choices. Following the recession of the early 90s, these two countries introduced a particular form of capital taxation. So before the 90s, capital income was taxed under personal income taxes. After the crisis, what happened is that they completely separate capital income from labor income, and they tax capital at a flat rate. So basically, capital passed from a progressive taxation to a flat taxation that was much lower than the level of labor taxation. So as you can see from these charts, the increase in the top income shares in Sweden and Finland correspond exactly to the introduction of the dual tax system. In Sweden, indeed, it happened in 91, where it was introduced, and in Finland, it happened, the increase followed after a few years because this system of taxation was introduced in 93. And if you look at the Netherlands, which can be a similar country, small, open economy, we do not observe the same trend. So top income share increase, but they increase later, and they do not follow the same pattern as in these other two countries. So beyond these general taxation trends, we had an important contribution in the Gini project, a paper by Romer, which stressed the increasing importance of neoliberalist think tanks in the US, which stress the incentives of reducing taxation at the top for promoting growth and employment, and at the same level they were stressing the disincentives of benefits, for example, of unemployment benefits. And what we observe is that the tax and benefit policy of the last decades, they were quite in line with this prescription. So in general, we can say that if at the beginning, in the 80s, the increase in income inequality was mostly explained by wage inequality and by labor market, since the mid-90s, there was a change in the explanation of inequality. So inequality is increasingly explained by the reduced role of redistribution and by the increasing role of capital incomes and self-employment. Here there is a notable exception to this general trend. So normally when we talk about capital income is returns, for example, from financial assets. However, in the last decades, we see that there was an increasing home ownership in many countries. And the returns from this capital, or this wealth, is not taken into account in standard measures of inequality because it's not realized. It's income in kind, so you don't see it in the standard measures of inequality. But it was important in explaining the actual economic well-being of households. Here you see the blue part is a standard measure of disposable income inequality, and the red part is a measure of income inequality, including the returns from home ownership. As you can see, when we include the economic advantage of being homeowners, reduce income inequality, especially in Eastern European and Southern countries. This is to introduce the second part of the presentation on the importance of wealth and wealth inequality. So the book of Piketty was discussed this morning, and I think it's useful to stress its importance. Beyond the policy conclusion that Piketty makes, there was clearly a shift in the importance of wealth with respect to income in the last decades. If you observe the ratio between wealth and income in many countries, they increase in most of the countries. This is due to several reasons, and mostly because of the poor macroeconomic performance of most countries. And the second crucial aspect is that there was an amazing increasing of debt in many households, in many countries, especially in Nordic countries. This completely changed the picture of inequality and of wealth inequality. The measurement of wealth is very challenging, so of course it's very hard to have the same trends we have for income inequality, for wealth inequality, because some countries such as Greece don't have wealth surveys, so it's kind of difficult to assess, to compare the levels and to assess trends. There are a series of methodological problems. For example, educational loans are included, but you cannot measure human capital, so it's not easy to measure wealth. However, according to the measures that we have, we can notice an increase in wealth inequality and an increase in polarization. So by polarization, what I mean is that there was an increased difference between households who own a lot of wealth and households who own zero, and in particular who own a negative wealth. Also for wealth, we can see a changing geography of inequalities in Europe. So the evidence here is more limited, but we had countries in which wealth inequality was increasing and now is decreasing, and the other way around. So the recent estimates actually show that wealth inequality is increasing especially in the last years, are increasing in several countries. So about the drivers, what we found in the Gini project is that we observe large differences in wealth inequality across countries, but the drivers which explain these differences are not the same that are able to explain the trends within countries. So what we see is that the increasing role of finance and of billionaires and the increasing importance of debt explain the trends within countries, and in particular the role of taxation in boosting the high take-up of debt, for example, with mortgage deductions, very generous system of mortgage deduction in the Nordic countries. However, the cross-country differences are explained by, they seem to be explained by institutional factors. And here I come to the wealth, what we call wealth paradoxes. What we see is that in countries which have a low level of income inequality, again, Sweden and Finland, we observe a high level, above average level of wealth inequality. What we see that in general is not a straight correlation, but countries with more generous welfare systems, in particular that are more generous in social housing, we observe a higher level of wealth inequality because this maybe may not give incentives for households at the bottom of the income distribution to accumulate assets. The second paradox of wealth inequality is that is its relationship with income inequality. This is strange because we would expect countries with a low level of income inequality to have a low level of wealth inequality, and this does not happen. And we have, for example, at the other end, countries with a high level of income inequality, such as Mediterranean countries, and a low level of wealth inequality. The second paradox is timing. So the evolution of wealth inequality didn't completely follow the evolution in income inequality. In the US, for example, while income inequality was increasing a lot throughout the 80s and the 90s, we do not observe a parallel trend of wealth inequality. It was increasing, but not as much as income inequality. And what we observe is an increasing wealth inequality only after the latest recession. The final point is that the increasing importance of debt change the correspondence between the income and the wealth distribution. So normally what we are used to analyze is income inequality on one side and wealth inequality on the others. But it's not straightforward that people who are income poor are also wealth poor. So what we observe is that there are, especially Mediterranean countries, a share of households which are defined as income poor, but they are wealth rich, and this is a case of mostly of older households. And in the Nordic country, we see the opposite. So we see households that are defined as extremely wealth poor, but they are not income poor. And this, of course, is explained by the role of debt and by the generous system of mortgage deduction in place in this country. This is because countries, families who can take up so much debt, they have a kind of strength in the labor market because they eventually will have to repay this debt. So if we look at the dispersion of the distribution of wealth and the distribution of wealth but rank over income groups, we see that this last distribution is much more compressed. So it would be, the studies are still not very common and it's quite difficult to mix the two distributions, but it makes much more sense to consider the two distributions jointly because there is not a straightforward correlation between the two, and this is probably increased. The correlation between the income and wealth distribution probably decreased in the last years. So what we see, to summarize, compared to the late 2000s, we observe again an increasing trends of income and wealth inequalities. However, we observe a changing pattern, so the countries which were experiencing inequality and increasing inequality before are not the same in many cases as a country who were experiencing increases before. We have a new understanding on the mutual links between inequality and growth. So inequality, is not reduces automatically by growth, and inequality can have bad effects on growth. We have, a better understanding of the role of policies in driving income inequalities, and we have a new understanding of the importance of wealth and on the importance of wealth inequality. However, what we see in policy effects, we see again a cutting of benefits, a weakening of labor market regulation, a shift from labor taxes, which are progressive, to regressive taxes such as consumption. And when we see a shift to wealth taxes, we see a shift to what they are normally called property taxes, which are not in some cases, which were actually the kind of, they are acting on something that was kind of redistributive. And we do not see the same attention to other forms of wealth taxes, such as inheritance or the issue of tax avoidance. I would just like to mention again Sweden, which is considered one of the most equal countries and is still one of the most equal countries, but in the last, since the mid-2000s, they abolished any form of wealth taxation, including inheritance. So what's next? It would be useful to use the past lesson from the crisis and to see, how the discretionary policy choices undertaken after this crisis had a permanent effect. If we are concerned about the macroeconomic effects of inequality, we should pay better attention to the causes of inequality rather than the effects of the crisis. And finally, there should be a shift in the attention of policy to a wise assessment of wealth and top incomes, which is not straightforward, but more attention should be given to this issue. Thanks for the attention.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Και νομίζω ότι μια και θα πάμε για το φαγητό για να μείνουμε πιστοί στο χρόνο. Εγώ θεωρώ ότι ήταν δύο εξαιρετικές εισηγήσεις. Και η πρώτη αναφορικά με την υπόθεση εργασίας, παγκοσμιοποίηση, εθνικισμός, εθνικιστικά κινήματα κλπ. Που έχουμε στην Ευρώπη, αλλά και η δεύτερη με την εξέλιξη των ανισοτήτων και ιδιαίτερα βέβαια τις πολιτικές που προκάλεσαν αυτή την ανισότητα. Διότι στην οικονομία τίποτα δεν γίνεται από μόνο του. Όλα γίνονται με τις επιλογές της οικονομικής πολιτικής. Και στις δικές μας έρευνες που κάνουμε και στην Ελλάδα και στις νότιες χώρες, αυτό το φαινόμενο έχει συμβεί επειδή τα τελευταία χρόνια οι φορολογικές πολιτικές έφυγαν από την προοδευτική φορολογία, που είναι μια δικαιότερη φορολογία, και πήγαν στην αναλογική φορολογία. Επομένως, εάν χρησιμοποιείς σαν εργαλείο αυτό, ξέρεις ότι μετά από μερικά χρόνια θα εντείνεις την ανισότητα στην κατανομή του εισοδήματος. Είναι πλέον ξεκαθαρισμένα αυτά τα πράγματα στην οικονομική και φορολογική ανάλυση. Ευχαριστώ πολύ ακόμα μια φορά. Thank you. Και επιστρέφουμε στις 2 η ώρα μετά το γεύμα που έχουμε 1 με 2. Ευχαριστώ πολύ όλους σας.